They called her a thief in front of everyone, without evidence, without hesitation. They took her uniform, her wages, her reputation, and they threw her out into the rain like she was nothing, like she had always been nothing, like the years she had given them meant less than the word of one woman who had never once looked her in the eye. She stood on those steps, soaking wet, $42 in her pocket, her mother's recipe book pressed against her chest, and she made herself a promise she would not break. So she picked up her suitcase. She found an advertisement torn from a newspaper, soft at the folds from being read too many times. And she traveled through the cold to the edge of Wyoming, to a ranch that looked like grief had moved in and never left. To a widower who looked at her the way everyone looked at her, like she was the wrong size, the wrong shape, the wrong kind of woman for a life like this. He hired her to cook, to clean, to stay invisible. He had no idea what he had actually let through his door, because the woman he dismissed at first glance, the woman the whole world had been underestimating her entire life, was about to save his sons, restore his home, survive the worst blizzard the valley had seen in years, and make a cold, broken man remember what it felt like to be alive. This is her story. Hit like, subscribe, and drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And don't you dare leave before the ending, because the last thing she says will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. The morning they fired her, it was raining. Not the soft, forgiving kind of rain that washes things clean, but the cold, relentless kind that soaks through wool coats and gets into bones, and reminds a person, with every grey drop, that the world has no particular interest in their comfort. Mabel Hart stood on the steps of the Callaway Hotel in Cheyenne, Wyoming, her large canvas suitcase at her feet, her winter coat buttoned all the way to the collar, and she did not cry. She had promised herself years ago that she would not give people the satisfaction of watching her fall apart in public. She had kept that promise through every whisper, every sideways glance, every comment that was meant to be quiet, but never quite was. She kept it now. But her hands were shaking. "You're lucky we're not calling the sheriff," Gerald Callaway had told her 20 minutes earlier, from behind his enormous mahogany desk, his small eyes never quite meeting hers. "The Hendersons are one of our most valued guests. Mrs. Henderson is very clear about what she saw." "I didn't take the brooch," Mabel had said. Her voice was steady. She had made sure of that. "I found it under the vanity table when I was cleaning. I set it on the dresser because I assumed she'd knocked it off by accident. That's all I did." Gerald had looked at her the way men like him always looked at women like her. Like she was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be heard. His eyes had travelled, just briefly, down the length of her body and back up again, and she had seen the calculation behind them. The decision had already been made before she walked into the room. She understood that now. "Mrs. Henderson is a personal friend of my wife's," he said. "I'm sorry, Mabel, I really am, but I have to protect the hotel's reputation." His reputation, his wife's friend. The brooch had been on the dresser, right there in plain sight. But it was easier to believe the slim, pearl-necklaced guest than the plus-size housekeeper who'd worked 60-hour weeks without complaint for 3.5 years. Mabel had picked up her things and walked out without a word. And now she stood in the rain with $42.70 in her coat pocket, a worn leather suitcase containing everything she owned, and a smaller bag tucked under her arm, the one that held her mother's recipe book, wrapped in oilcloth to keep it dry. That book was the one thing in the world she would not allow the rain to touch. She stood there for a long moment, water dripping from the brim of her hat, and she let herself breathe. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the folded newspaper advertisement she had torn from the Cheyenne Gazette 3 weeks earlier, before all of this had happened, back when she'd been quietly planning an exit from a job that had started to feel like a slow suffocation. Seeking. Capable woman for cook and housekeeper position, Iron Creek Ranch, Laramie County, room and board provided, inquire, C. Pierce. She had written the letter on a Sunday evening, on the good stationery she kept in her bureau drawer. She had not expected a reply. She almost never expected anything good, but the reply had come 4 days later, brief, practical, written in the hand of a man who clearly had no patience for formality. "Miss Hart, position still open, wages fair, work is hard. Come if you're serious. C. Pierce." She had intended to write back and arrange a proper start date. She had intended to give the hotel 2 weeks' notice, to leave on her own terms. Well, The terms had been decided for her, as they so often were. Mabel tucked the advertisement back into her pocket, picked up her suitcase, and walked toward the stage line office. The journey to Iron Creek took the better part of 2 days. The first leg was a hired coach that rattled and swayed over frozen roads toward the smaller settlement of Granger's Bend, a town of perhaps 300 souls perched at the edge of the high country like something the mountains had accidentally dropped and never bothered to retrieve. From there, a taciturn man named Holt, who appeared to work as a combination of mail carrier, supply runner, and general conveyor of people and things across the valley, agreed to take her the remaining 14 miles to the Pierce property for $2, and the promise that she wouldn't ask him questions the whole way. She didn't ask him questions the whole way. She watched out the wagon's open side as the landscape changed, the scrubby plains giving way to rolling hills, and then the hills giving way to something more severe. Steep ridgelines white with early snow, dark pine forests thick on the slopes, valleys so wide and silent they seemed to absorb sound entirely. It was wild country, honest country in its way. It didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. She respected that. Holt deposited her at the foot of a long gravel lane with a hand-painted sign nailed to a post, Iron Creek Ranch, C. Pierce. He handed down her suitcase without ceremony, clicked his tongue at his horse, and continued down the road without so much as a backward glance. Mabel stood at the foot of that lane and looked up toward the ranch house. It was a solid structure, 2 stories of grey timber, with a covered porch running the length of the front and a stone chimney rising from the left side. There were several outbuildings she could see. A large barn painted dark red, a smaller structure that was probably a smokehouse, a chicken coop with a leaning fence that badly needed repair. Beyond the buildings, rolling pasture land stretched toward the tree line, and beyond that, the mountains rose like a wall against the sky, their peaks lost in low cloud. It was the kind of place that could have been beautiful. Instead, it looked exhausted. The house needed painting. The porch railing had a post missing. One of the shutters hung at an angle. The garden alongside the front walk was a tangle of dead vines and frost-blackened stems. Not just the natural decay of winter, but the deeper neglect of a place where someone had stopped paying attention long ago. Mabel picked up her suitcase and walked up the lane. She knocked on the front door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then she heard boots on a wooden floor. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that did not hurry, and the door opened. Colton Pierce was not what she had pictured. She had expected someone older, perhaps, or softer in some way, a man worn down by grief into something gentler. Instead, she found a man who stood just over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders built by decades of physical labor, and a face that might have been handsome once, but had settled into something harder. A square jaw shadowed with several days of beard, dark hair shot through with grey at the temples, and eyes the colour of winter sky, pale grey-blue, and cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. He looked at her for one full, silent second. Then his gaze moved, just the way Gerald Calloway's had. That slight downward sweep and return, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not cruelty exactly, something more like recalculation. A reassessment of whatever he had expected. Mabel had seen that look 10,000 times. She was ready for it. "Mr. Pierce," she said, "I'm Mabel Hart. I wrote to you about the position." "I know who you are." His voice was low and dry, with the flat vowels of a man who'd spent most of his life outdoors. "Didn't expect you until Thursday. My circumstances changed." He studied her for a moment, and she met his gaze without flinching. She had learned long ago that people took their cues from you. If you looked away, they believed they were right to make you feel small. If you held their eye, sometimes, not always, but sometimes, they reconsidered. Colton Pierce stepped back from the doorway. "Kitchen's at the back," he said. "I'll show you the room. Supper's expected at 6. He turned and walked away down the hall without waiting to see if she followed. Mabel picked up her suitcase and stepped inside. The house was dark. That was the first thing that struck her. Not just the dimness of a winter afternoon, but a deeper darkness. The kind that accumulates in rooms where curtains stay closed and fires go unlit, and people move through their days without paying attention to light. The front hallway smelled of wood smoke, leather, and something stale beneath it all. A pair of muddy boots sat just inside the door with no rack to hold them. A coat hook on the wall held so many layers. Heavy coats, wool scarves, canvas work jackets. that the hook itself had begun to pull away from the plaster. She followed Colton Pierce down the hall and into the kitchen. The kitchen, at least, had a window, east-facing so it would catch the morning light, and a large iron cook stove that squatted in the corner like a reliable old friend. The stove was unlit. The iron pot on top of it held the remnants of what appeared to be yesterday's beans, or possibly the day before's. On the counter, a half loaf of bread going stale, a tin of salt, and a coffee pot that looked like it had seen better decades. Mabel set her bag down on the table and looked around without comment. "Through there is the pantry," Colton said, gesturing toward a narrow door. "Dry goods, some canned. There's a root cellar through the back door for what's stored down below. I'll need breakfast at 5:30, lunch at noon when we're not out on the range, supper at 6. What do the boys eat?" He stopped. Just for a moment, something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, that she already knew about the boys. He had mentioned them in his second letter, brief as it was. "Same as me," he said. "How old?" "Wyatt's 11, Eli's 7. "Any food they won't eat?" "I don't run a restaurant, Miss Hart." "No," she said evenly. "But you have children, and children are easier to feed when you know what they'll actually put in their mouths. I'm not asking to coddle them. I'm asking because it's useful information." He looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't tell if he was annoyed or simply unaccustomed to being answered. "Eli won't eat onions," he said finally. "Claims they make him sick. Wyatt eats everything. Boy has a stomach like a furnace." "Thank you." She began pulling back the pantry door. "I'll need a few things from town. I'll make a list. Holt makes a supply run Fridays." "That'll do." Colton stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment longer, as though he expected something else, some sign of hesitation perhaps, or some complaint about the state of things. When none came, he nodded once, told her room was at the top of the stairs on the right, and walked back down the hall. She heard the front door open and close. Mabel stood alone in the cold kitchen, listening to the silence of the house settle around her. Through the window, the afternoon light was already going grey. She opened the pantry door and began to take inventory. She found the boys at the supper table. They appeared like a pair of shy animals, heard before seen, a creak on the stairs, a murmured argument outside the dining room door, and then they slipped inside and sat down without being asked, side by side, as though they had rehearsed it. Wyatt, the older one, had his father's colouring. Dark hair, those grey-blue eyes. But his face was open where his father's was closed, watchful in the way of a boy who has learned to read rooms quickly. He sat up straight and assessed her with the frank curiosity of a child who hasn't yet learned to be subtle about it. Eli was smaller, round-cheeked, with his mother's colouring, if the faded photograph on the mantel was any indication. Lighter hair, brown eyes that were enormous in his face. He had a smudge of something on his chin, dirt or possibly axle grease, and he had forgotten to push his chair in properly, so one leg stuck out into the room at an angle. They both stared at her. She set a basket of fresh bread on the table, the one thing she'd managed to accomplish in the last 2 hours. Thank the stars for starter she'd brought from Cheyenne, and a pot of beef and root vegetable stew made from what she'd found in the root cellar, flavoured with dried herbs from the small bundle she kept in her bag. The smell changed the room immediately. She saw it happen, the way both boys lifted their faces almost involuntarily, the way their expressions shifted from wariness to something more complicated. "I'm Mabel," she said, sitting down across from them. "I'll be cooking and keeping house." "We know," Wyatt said. He was trying to sound bored, but his eyes were on the bread. "Pa told us." "Did he tell you anything else?" "He said you were from Cheyenne." Wyatt picked up his fork, then remembered himself and set it back down. "He said you'd be staying in Mrs. Callahan's old room." "Who was Mrs. Callahan?" "The last housekeeper," Eli said. He had a small, piping voice, very serious for a 7-year-old. "She left in October. She said—" He stopped. "What did she say?" Eli glanced at his brother. Some fraternal communication happened that Mabel couldn't quite read. "She said this house was too sad," Wyatt said finally, with the careful neutrality of a boy repeating something he'd decided not to editorialize on. Mabel looked at him steadily. "Houses aren't sad," she said. "People are sad. Houses just hold what's put into them." She picked up the ladle. "Bread?" Wyatt looked at her for a moment, then held out his plate. She served them. She served herself. She listened as Eli began, cautiously at first, to ask questions, where she'd grown up, Missouri originally, whether she'd ever seen a real grizzly bear. No, but she'd seen the aftermath. Whether she knew how to make pie. Of course she knew how to make pie. What kind of question was that? And she answered each one without fuss, without performance, as though it were the most ordinary conversation in the world. Colton returned from whatever he had been doing in the barn just before 6:30. He came in through the kitchen, stopped at the sight of the empty stove burners and the warm pot moved to the warming rack, and followed the smell of food to the dining room. He stood in the doorway and looked at the table, at his sons, actually talking, Eli's hands moving as he described something, Wyatt leaning forward with his elbows on the table, a piece of bread in his hand, at the set table, the lit lamp in the center, the steam rising from the stew pot. Something crossed his face too quickly for her to name it. He sat down. Mabel passed him the bread without comment. He took a piece, looked at it as though he'd forgotten what bread looked like when it was fresh, and ate it. Nobody said much, but the silence was different from the silence she'd walked into that afternoon. It had less weight to it. After supper, when the boys had gone upstairs and she was clearing the table, she heard Colton's chair push back. She expected him to walk out, back to the barn, back to whatever it was he retreated to in the evenings. Instead, he appeared in the kitchen doorway. "It was good," he said. Just that. Flat. Simple. Like a man who had forgotten how to offer compliments but was trying to remember. "Thank you," she said, without stopping what she was doing. He stood there for a moment as though he might say something else. Then he turned and walked out. Mabel listened to his footsteps on the porch, the creak of the rocking chair outside, the silence that followed. She dried her hands on her apron, picked up her mother's recipe book from the counter where she'd set it earlier, and opened it to the first page. Her mother had written something there years ago in her cramped and careful handwriting. "A meal is just food. A meal made with attention is a gift. Never forget which one you're giving." Mabel ran her thumb across the ink, worn soft with years of handling. She had been thrown away. She had been lied about. She had arrived here in the cold with nothing but what she could carry. And she had been looked over and looked past by a man who saw her size before he saw her. She was used to that. What she was not willing to get used to, what she had never once let herself accept, was the idea that it was the final word on who she was. She closed the book. Outside, the wind was picking up, sweeping down from the mountain passes with the first real bite of deep winter. Inside, the kitchen was warm, and the dishes were clean, and somewhere upstairs, a 7-year-old boy with enormous brown eyes and a smudge on his chin was getting ready for bed in a house that smelled for the first time in a long while like fresh bread. Mabel Hart pulled her apron off, hung it on the hook beside the stove, and went upstairs to her room. She had work to do in the morning. She always had work to do in the morning, and she had never, not once in her life, failed to show up for it. The ranch house settled into silence around her as the wind pressed against the eaves. In the dark, it was hard to imagine that anything had changed. But something had. Something small and stubborn like a coal held carefully in cupped hands, glowing, not yet flame, but refusing to go out. The first week was a test she hadn't been warned about. Not the work itself, the work she could handle. She had been handling hard work since she was 12 years old, standing on a step stool beside her mother in a kitchen no bigger than a closet, learning that food was never just food, that the act of feeding people was an act of choosing them, of saying, "You matter enough for me to do this carefully." She understood labor. She understood early mornings and aching feet and the particular exhaustion that comes from giving a task everything you have. What she hadn't anticipated was the silence. Iron Creek Ranch operated on a kind of enforced quiet that went beyond mere reservation. Colton Pierce did not make conversation. He issued brief, functional statements. The fence on the north pasture needed checking. Halt would be by Friday. There was a split in the kitchen floor that she should mind in the dark. And then he disappeared back into the machinery of running a cattle operation, as though language itself was a resource he rationed carefully. The boys followed his lead in the mornings, appearing at the breakfast table red-eyed and rumple-haired, eating with efficient focus, then pulling on coats and boots and vanishing into their separate orbits. Wyatt out to the barn with his father, Eli to whatever a 7-year-old did with himself during the long, grey hours of a Wyoming winter morning. The house held its silence like a held breath. Mabel worked inside it anyway. She attacked the kitchen first, because the kitchen was hers to command, and she intended to command it properly. She scoured the iron stove until it gleamed. She reorganized the pantry, grouping dry goods by use rather than by the apparent system of whoever had put them there last, which seemed to have been throw things in and hope for the best. She found 4 pounds of cornmeal in the back of a shelf, a good tin of lard, dried apples that were still salvageable, a jar of molasses with the lid welded shut by time that surrendered to her with some effort. She found, in the very back corner behind a crate of tinned beans, a small brown paper package she didn't recognize. She opened it carefully. Dried lavender tied in small bundles. Someone had put it there deliberately, years ago, to keep the pantry smelling sweet. She stood holding the dried lavender for a moment. Someone had cared about this house once, very much. She set the lavender on the shelf where she could see it, and went back to work. By the end of the first week, the kitchen was transformed. Not in any dramatic way. She hadn't repainted the walls or replaced the floorboards, but in the way a room transforms when someone begins paying attention to it. The windows were clean, the curtains taken down and shaken out and rehung, let in what winter light there was. The stove stayed lit and warm from 4 in the morning until 8 at night. And the smells, that was what changed the house most profoundly, in ways she hadn't even calculated. The smell of coffee in the morning, dark and real. Bread baking before noon. Something simmering in the afternoon, beef or beans or a chicken she'd bartered for with the neighbouring property's wife when the woman came by with eggs. The house didn't smell stale anymore. It smelled lived in. Eli noticed first. He had a habit, she discovered it by accident on the 4th morning, of hanging around the kitchen doorway after breakfast, pretending to be doing something else. He'd pick up a piece of firewood from the stack by the back door and study it with great apparent interest. He'd retie a boot he'd just finished tying. He found elaborate reasons to be in the vicinity without technically being inside. On the 4th morning, Mabel was rolling biscuit dough and didn't look up when she heard him. "You can come in," she said. "I don't bite." A pause. "Pa says the kitchen's your workspace." "Your pa's right that it's my workspace. That doesn't mean visitors aren't welcome." She pressed a biscuit cutter into the dough. "Come hold this for me." She heard small feet on the floorboards. A moment later, Eli appeared at her elbow. Close enough that she could see the perpetual smudge on his chin had migrated slightly to the left. "Hold this." She handed him the extra biscuit cutter. He took it with the solemnity of a child given a surgical instrument. "What do I do?" "Wait until I need you." She worked the dough. "Do you like biscuits?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. What else do you like?" He thought about this with visible seriousness. "Cornbread," he said, "and apple cake, and soup with the little noodles." He paused. "Ma used to make soup with the little noodles." The kitchen went very quiet, but not an uncomfortable quiet. More the kind that comes when something real has been said and both people know it. "What kind of noodles?" Mabel asked, her voice the same as it had been, light and practical. "The flat ones, not the round ones. Pa tried to make it once, but he used the round ones and it wasn't right." "Flat noodles it is." She held out her hand for the second cutter. "You can come in the kitchen any time you want, Eli. As long as you don't touch the stove without asking, we won't have any problems." He handed her the cutter. He didn't leave. He stayed for an hour, sitting on the flour sack in the corner, watching her work with the quiet absorption of a child cataloguing something important. He didn't ask a continuous stream of questions. He'd save them up and release them in small batches, and they were good questions, curious and specific. How did she know how much flour? How did she know when the bread was done if she didn't look inside the oven? Why did she add the salt at the end of some things and the beginning of others? She answered every one. By the 2nd week, he was coming to the kitchen every morning without pretense. Wyatt took longer. Wyatt was 11, which meant he was old enough to have developed defenses and young enough that they still showed. He was polite in the careful, surface way of a child who has been taught his manners but is withholding judgment. He said please and thank you. He did not take extra portions without asking. He helped clear the table on the evenings his father reminded him to. But he watched her, not with Eli's open curiosity, but with the measured, assessing gaze of a boy who has been burned before and intends not to be burned again. She didn't push. She knew that kind of wariness. She'd earned her own version of it over years of being let down by people she'd trusted. You didn't cure that with charm or forced warmth. You cured it with consistency, with being exactly who you said you were day after day until the evidence became undeniable. So she kept being exactly who she was. And on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week, Wyatt came in from the barn with a split in the knee of his work pants, a wide, ragged tear that was going to unravel itself into a genuine problem within a day. He stood in the kitchen doorway, holding his knee together with one hand, looking mortified in the particular way of older children who consider it beneath them to ask for help. Mabel was at the counter, paring potatoes. She looked at the knee, she looked at his face. She set down the potato. "Sit," she said, nodding at the kitchen chair. "It's fine, I'll just—" "Sit down, Wyatt. It'll take 5 minutes." He sat. She got the mending kit from the drawer. She'd found it shoved in the back, behind a tangle of wire and odd buttons, and had reorganized it the first week. And she repaired the tear with the quick, sure stitches of someone who'd been mending her own clothes since she was a child. She didn't make a fuss about it. She didn't tell him to be more careful or ask how it happened. She just fixed it. When she finished, she bit the thread clean and looked up. Wyatt was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. "Good as new," she said. He looked down at his knee, then back up at her. "Mrs. Callahan couldn't sew," he said. It was not a compliment exactly, more like the careful offering of a fact, a small piece of information tendered as something more. "Well," Mabel said, putting the mending kit away, "now you know I can." He was quiet for a moment, then, "She burned the biscuits too." "Did she?" "Every time." He paused. "Yours are better." Mabel turned back to her potatoes. "Thank you, Wyatt." She heard the chair scrape back, heard him cross the kitchen. Then he stopped. "Miss Mabel?" He had not called her that before. He'd been avoiding calling her anything. "Eli talks about you at night, after we go up." His voice was careful, measured. "He says you taught him how biscuits rise." "The yeast," she said. "It's alive. Did you know that? Little living organisms that eat sugar and breathe out the gas that makes dough puff up. Eli found that very interesting." "He finds most things interesting." "That's a good quality." Another pause. She had learned not to fill his pauses. He was a boy who thought before he spoke, and that deserved respect. "He hasn't talked about Ma in a while," Wyatt said quietly. "He talked about her to you." Mabel set the potato down. She turned and looked at Wyatt. Really looked at him. This 11-year-old boy with his father's eyes and all of the grief he'd been quietly carrying without complaint. "He loves her very much," she said. "He should be able to talk about her." Wyatt nodded once, with a stiffness that meant he was close to something he didn't want her to see. "Yeah," he said. "He should." He turned and walked out before she could say anything else. She picked up the potato again. Her hands were perfectly steady, but her chest ached in the soft, bittersweet way it always did when she understood something more fully than she had before. This family wasn't broken. It was holding on, with both hands, in the dark, and it was exhausting. She could help with that. She intended to. The changes to the ranch began slowly, the way most real things do, not in dramatic gestures, but in small accumulations. She repaired the hook on the back door that had been pulling away from the frame, using tools she found in the shed, and skills learned from necessity over a life lived without the luxury of always being able to call on someone else. She replaced the kitchen curtains. The old ones were so thin and grey, they admitted almost no light even when open, with material she bought in Granger's Bend on the first Friday she had off, using her own money because she hadn't yet been paid and the curtains needed doing, yellow gingham, bright and plain. She had hung them before breakfast, and Eli had walked into the kitchen, stopped in the middle of the floor, and stared at them with an expression of pure wonder, as though someone had installed the sun. "They're yellow," he said. "Observant," she said, pouring his oatmeal. "We didn't have yellow before." "You do now." She heard about the curtains from Holt, who'd heard it from the feed store man in Granger's Bend, who'd heard it from someone else, that Colton Pierce had apparently stood in his own kitchen the morning they went up and stared at them for a full minute without speaking, which from Colton Pierce apparently constituted a significant reaction. Colton himself said nothing to her about the curtains. But that same evening, she noticed that the firewood stack beside the kitchen door was fuller than she'd left it. Significantly fuller, stacked high and tight against the wall, enough to last several days without her needing to go out in the cold for more. She hadn't asked for it. She hadn't mentioned the stack was getting low. She didn't say anything about it either. It became, in its way, a kind of conversation. She found little things done that she hadn't asked for. The squeaking hinge on the kitchen door silenced. A rough edge on the porch step that she'd been minding carefully in the dark, sanded smooth. The leaning post on the chicken coop fence straightened and newly nailed. None of it came with acknowledgement or comment. She would simply notice, the way you notice a shift in weather. A change in atmosphere that tells you something has moved without being able to point to the exact moment it happened. In return, she began leaving a plate warming on the back of the stove on the nights he came in late from checking the cattle. Nothing elaborate. Whatever was left from supper, kept hot and covered with a cloth. She never mentioned doing it. He never mentioned finding it. But the plate was always empty in the morning, rinsed and set on the drying rack. They communicated like this for weeks, in the language of practical care, of small attentions, of noticing without saying. It was perhaps not so different, she thought, from how two people in the wilderness might signal they were not a threat. Cautiously. With evidence rather than words. It was Eli who told her about Catherine. He didn't do it intentionally. They were in the kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, a rare quiet hour, and Mabel was teaching him to cut out cookie shapes from sugar dough, which he was approaching with the solemn precision of someone diffusing something dangerous. She had told him that the shapes had to be clean, or the cookies spread wrong, and he had taken this information extremely seriously. "Did you have kids?" he asked, pressing the star cutter with great care. "No," she said, "just me." "How come?" "It just didn't happen that way." He considered this, lifting the star and setting it on the baking tin. "Ma wanted 4 kids," he said, as though this were a natural continuation of the same topic. "She told Wyatt. Wyatt told me." He picked up the round cutter. "She only got us 2, though." "2 sounds like a lot to me," Mabel said. "She died when Eli was born," Wyatt said from the doorway. Both of them looked up. Wyatt was standing in the frame with his coat still on, a rim of frost in his hair. He must have come in from outside without them hearing the door. Mabel watched him carefully. "She died when Eli was born," he said again, more quietly, as though he'd needed to say it a second time to prove he could. "Pa doesn't talk about it, but I was old enough to remember. I was 4. He looked at his brother. Eli never knew her. Eli was holding the cookie cutter against the dough, very still. "I know her from the picture," Eli said. "That's not the same." "I know." Eli's voice was small and absolutely certain. The kitchen held all 3 of them in a silence that was not empty. It was full, packed dense with something heavy that had been carried a long time. Mabel didn't move to fill it. She didn't offer platitudes or reach for someone's hand or try to redirect the moment into something more comfortable. She simply stayed in it with them, the way you stay with someone in a storm, not pretending the rain isn't real, just making sure they know they're not standing in it alone. After a moment, she said, "Her name was Catherine." Wyatt looked at her. "How did you know?" "I saw the lavender in the pantry. Someone put it there a long time ago and kept it there on purpose. Things like that usually come from the person who made a house a home." She looked at the boys in turn. "Was she the one who kept the house?" "She grew lavender out back," Wyatt said. He walked fully into the kitchen, shrugged off his coat and hung it on the hook. Something she had asked him twice to do and he'd done maybe once before. "There's still some growing. Comes back every summer." "Does your father know it's still there?" Wyatt shrugged, with the specific, studied casualness of a boy who knows the answer and doesn't want to say it. "He doesn't go to that side of the house much." Mabel absorbed that. She turned back to the dough. "Come help me with these, both of you. We'll have a full pan." They both came. It was the most they'd ever talked about Catherine. Mabel suspected it was the most they'd talked about her with anyone, that grief had calcified in this house into a stone none of them had found a way around. She didn't pretend otherwise. She just made sure, from that afternoon onward, that the kitchen was a place where the stone could sit on the table without anyone having to pretend it wasn't there. She had been at Iron Creek for 5 weeks when she made her decision about the dining room. The dining room had been bothering her since the first day. It was a good-sized room, bigger than necessary for just the 4 of them, with a long oak table and 4 chairs that could have been arranged to feel welcoming, but instead sat pushed together in the center of the floor, as though the table itself had retreated into itself. The walls were bare, the windows were undressed. A single hanging lamp gave just enough light to eat by, and nothing more. It had the feel of a room being used against its will. She had a tablecloth in her suitcase. She'd had it there since Missouri, her mother's, embroidered in cream and rose along the edges, with small sprigs of lavender worked into the corners. Her mother had made it over the course of 2 winters, sitting beside the kitchen stove in the evenings, her needle moving with the patient precision of a woman who took pride in what her hands could make. Mabel had carried it across 3 states and 2 years of declining circumstances because she couldn't bear to leave it behind. It was the most valuable thing she owned. She took it out of the suitcase on a Friday evening when the ranch was quiet, shook it out carefully, and carried it downstairs. She didn't ask permission. She had learned that about herself over time. She was not the kind of woman who asked permission to make things better. She had asked permission too many times in her life, and the answer had too often been no, handed down by people with no good reason to refuse except that her doing something confident made them uncomfortable. She spread the cloth over the dining table. She adjusted it until it hung evenly. She stepped back. The room changed. It was remarkable how much it changed. The cloth was the warmest thing in that house. All that careful cream and rose, all those patient winter evenings her mother had poured into it, and it transformed the bare oak table into something that looked like it had been waiting for people to gather around it. She found 2 candlesticks in the kitchen drawer, old ones, heavy brass, pushed to the back. She cleaned them, set them at each end of the table and lit them. Then she stood in the doorway and looked at what she'd made. She called the boys for supper. Eli came first, running his usual half-trot down the stairs, and stopped dead at the dining room entrance. His mouth fell open. He looked at the table. He looked at her. He looked at the table again. "Where did that come from?" he breathed. "My mother made it," she said. "It's so pretty. Come sit down." Wyatt came in behind him, moving more slowly, and she watched the same transformation happen on his face. That involuntary softening, a kind of wonder-struck quality he hadn't planned to show. He sat down without speaking. But he reached out and touched the embroidered edge with 2 fingers. Very lightly, the way you touch something you don't want to damage. Colton came in from outside, still in his work coat, and stopped in the doorway. He stood there for a long moment. Mabel kept her attention on serving the food, but she was watching him in her peripheral vision. She had learned to watch rooms carefully, a skill born of years of needing to know when things were about to shift. She saw the way the sight hit him, not with warmth, not immediately, with something more complicated than that. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved across the tablecloth slowly, as though reading something. He looked at the candlesticks. He looked at the light they threw on his sons' faces. Something moved behind his expression that she couldn't name and wouldn't have been able to describe to anyone. Like watching weather change over mountains. You could see it happening, but you couldn't say exactly what it was. He sat down. He picked up his fork. "This was your mother's?" he asked, without looking at her. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "It's good work." She was a careful woman. He nodded once and began to eat. That was all, but something in the room had shifted. Something that had nothing to do with tablecloths or candlesticks, that couldn't be named or measured, but could certainly be felt. It was the sense of a house remembering what it had once been. Of rooms beginning, slowly and painfully, to breathe again. Later that night, Mabel sat at the kitchen table long after the boys had gone to bed, with her mother's recipe book open in front of her and a cup of tea going cold at her elbow. She was not reading the book exactly, more resting her eyes on the familiar handwriting, the way you rest your eyes on something you love. She heard boots on the porch, the slow creak of the rocking chair, the long silence that followed. She had been in this house for 5 weeks. She had come here with nothing, thrown out of another life by a lie told by someone with more social capital and less honesty. She had expected to survive here, to do her work, collect her wages, keep her head down. She had not expected to start caring. That was the part she hadn't planned for. She closed the recipe book. She pressed her hand flat against the cover. Outside, the wind had died down, and in the quiet, she could hear the ranch settling. The tick of the cooling stove, the distant sound of cattle somewhere in the dark, the creak of the chair on the porch above the sound of nothing at all. She did not know what was coming. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not feel like a woman waiting to be told to leave. She felt tentatively and without ceremony, like a woman who had somewhere to be. The sky changed on a Wednesday. Mabel noticed it first thing in the morning when she stepped out to the back porch to bring in the last of the dried herbs she'd hung from the eave. The sky had gone the wrong color, a flat, yellowish white that had nothing to do with cloud cover and everything to do with what was building beyond the northern ridgeline. She had grown up in Missouri, not Wyoming, but she had lived long enough and paid enough attention to weather to know when the sky was making a promise it intended to keep. She went inside and mentioned it at breakfast. "That sky looks serious," she said, setting the oatmeal pot on the table. "Is there stock out on the upper pasture?" Colton looked up from his coffee. Something sharpened in his expression, the particular alertness of a man whose livelihood walked on 4 legs and lived outdoors. 12 head, he said. "We were going to rotate them down Friday. I'd move that to today." He looked at her for a moment, not dismissively. She had noticed, over the past weeks, that he had quietly stopped dismissing her, but with the assessing look of a man checking his own instincts against someone else's. He pushed back from the table and went to the window. He stood there long enough that Wyatt stopped eating and looked up. "Pa, eat your breakfast." Colton didn't turn around. His eyes were fixed on the ridgeline. "Wyatt, after you're done, saddle Remy. You're coming with me this morning." "What about school?" "School's in the house today." He turned from the window and his eyes moved briefly to Mabel, a look she couldn't fully interpret, somewhere between acknowledgement and something more careful than that. "We'll push the cattle down before noon. Should be back before it hits." Should be. She noted those words but didn't say anything about them. After they rode out, Colton and Wyatt together, Wyatt sitting his horse with the easy confidence of a boy raised in the saddle. Mabel stood at the kitchen window with her second cup of coffee and watched the sky. It was getting worse. The yellow-white had deepened toward grey, and the light had taken on that strange flat quality that made distances look different, that made the mountains seem closer and more enormous than usual, crouching. The wind had died completely, which was the part that worried her most. She had learned from her mother, who had learned it from hers, that silence before a storm was not peace. It was the world holding its breath. "Is it going to snow?" Eli asked from behind her. He had materialized at her elbow in his silent way, holding a piece of buttered bread he'd helped himself to from the counter. She had long since stopped being startled by his appearances. "It is," she said. "A lot?" She considered whether to soften it. She decided against it. Eli, she had come to understand, was a child who preferred honesty to comfort. He would rather know the real shape of a thing than be soothed with a pleasant version of it. In that way, he was very like her. "Probably a lot," she said. He chewed his bread and looked at the sky with serious brown eyes. "Pa and Wyatt are out there. They'll be back before it gets bad." "How do you know?" She turned and looked at him. "Because your father is not a foolish man. He knows this land better than I know this kitchen." She held his gaze until the tension in his small shoulders eased slightly. "Come on, we have things to do." The things she had in mind were deliberate. She spent the morning moving through the house with a purpose that was partly practical and partly protective. She was building a fortress against what was coming, not with boards and nails, but with warmth and smell and the simple human comfort of preparation. She filled the wood box beside the stove to capacity and then stacked more against the wall. She put a large pot of beef broth on to simmer. Beef bones she'd been saving, root vegetables, dried thyme. Because broth was warmth you could drink, and because the smell of it filled rooms in a way that made people feel less alone. She checked every lamp for oil. She found extra blankets in the cedar chest at the top of the stairs and brought them down. Eli helped with everything. He had that quality of a good helper. He didn't ask why, he just did what he was asked with concentration and minimal fuss. He carried blankets without complaint. He restacked the wood when her arrangement started to lean. He checked each lamp and called out his findings with the officiousness of someone conducting a very important audit. "This one's almost empty," he announced, holding up the lamp from the hallway. "Fill it from the can in the pantry, the blue one." "I know which one. I found it last week." A pause, and then his voice again, slightly muffled by distance. "Miss Mabel, there's 2 cans of the blue one." "Then we're well supplied." By noon, the house was as ready as she could make it. Mabel had also, not incidentally, mixed a batch of cinnamon cookie dough and refrigerated it on the back porch. Not because it was the right time for cookies, but because cinnamon cookies were Eli's favorite, and she had learned that the smell of cinnamon cookies baking was a very effective thing to have in your arsenal when a 7-year-old was frightened, and you needed him to have something to do with his hands. The first snowflakes fell at 12:30. By 1 o'clock, it was coming in earnest. By 2, it was a wall. Mabel stood at the front window and watched the lane disappear. The barn was gone, swallowed into white, reduced to a dark shape and then to nothing at all. The wind had come back with a vengeance, driving the snow horizontally, and it hit the window panes in waves that sounded like someone throwing handfuls of salt at the glass. Eli came and stood beside her. He did not say anything, but his hand found the side of her apron and held on, one fist closed around the fabric in a grip that cost him something to maintain. She did not look down. She knew that if she looked down, acknowledged what his hand was doing, he would let go. He was a proud child, and pride was one of his defenses, and she had learned to respect defenses even when she was working around them. "They'll shelter if they need to," she said, keeping her eyes on the white nothing beyond the glass. "Your father knows every hollow and lean-to on this property." "There's a shelter by the north fence," Eli said. His voice was very controlled. "Pa built it. He said it was for emergencies." "Well," she turned from the window, "this is exactly the kind of weather that shelter was built for. Come on, let's get those cookies in the oven." The kitchen saved them both for the next several hours. She let Eli do more than she usually would have, more cutting, more arranging, tasks that required enough focus to crowd out fear. He rolled the dough with the wooden pin she guided into his hands and pressed each cookie cutter down with the deliberate force of a child who needed something to push against. The kitchen filled with the smell of cinnamon and browned butter and warm sugar, and it was, Mabel knew, one of the more powerful things in the human experience. Not the cookies themselves, but the act of making them. The concrete sequence of small tasks that add up to something good and edible and real. She put the first pan in the oven. She poured Eli a glass of milk. She listened to the storm throw itself against the house. "Tell me something," Eli said. He was sitting on his flour sack perch with his hands wrapped around the glass. "A story." "What kind?" He thought. "Something true." She considered. "When I was about your age," she said, settling back against the counter, "we had a storm in Missouri that came on so fast my mother was still hanging laundry when it started. I was inside because, I could see her through the kitchen window. She had half the wash still on the line and the rain was coming sideways." "What did she do?" "She laughed," Mabel said, loudly, threw her arms up and just laughed. Got absolutely soaked, came inside and stripped off her wet dress right there in the kitchen and wrung it out in the sink like it was the most ordinary thing in the world." Eli giggled. A real one, surprised out of him. "She wasn't scared?" "She was scared of some things, but not of storms. She said a storm couldn't make up its mind what it wanted to be, and she had no patience for indecision." The oven pinged its readiness in the way the old iron stoves do, a shift in the sound of the heat, and she pulled the first batch out. The smell hit the room like a warm hand. Eli closed his eyes for just a second. When he opened them, they were a little brighter. 3 o'clock passed, then 4. The light, what little of it had existed, was gone entirely now, swallowed by the storm and by the early dark of a Wyoming winter afternoon. Mabel lit every lamp in the lower floor. She kept the stove burning at its maximum capacity. She sat Eli at the table with the checkerboard she'd found in the parlor closet, and they played 3 games. She won the first, he won the second by a strategy she genuinely had not seen coming, and the third they abandoned when the wind hit the house with a force that made the whole structure shudder, and Eli's eyes went wide. "It's all right," she said immediately. "That was really loud. Old houses are loud in wind. All those joints and timbers, they talk to each other when things move." She moved her piece. "Your turn." He looked at the board. He looked at the window where nothing was visible but black and the driving white shapes of snow. He looked back at the board. "He's been gone 9 hours," he said. She did not pretend that wasn't a long time. "I know. Wyatt's out there too. I know that too." "Aren't you scared?" She looked at him across the checkerboard. Eli Pierce, 7 years old, with his enormous brown eyes and his fist still tight around his checker piece, and all the grief and love and fear that he'd been carrying in his small chest since before he could name any of those things. "Yes," she said. "I am." He blinked. She could tell he hadn't expected her to say that. "But being scared doesn't mean something bad is going to happen," she said. "Sometimes scared is just what love feels like when it's worried. And worried means there's something worth worrying about." She held his gaze. "Your father and your brother are worth worrying about. So yes, I'm scared. And I'm going to keep that stove burning and that lamp lit and supper hot on the back burner, because that's what we can do. That's what we have control over." Eli put his checker down on the board. His jaw was set in a way that reminded her very much of his father. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. "Your move." The wind reached its worst sometime around 6. Mabel had served Eli his supper at the table, the broth thick and dark and restorative, with bread she'd baked fresh that afternoon, and he'd eaten almost all of it, which she counted as a victory, because a child who eats is a child who is coping. She'd left the large pot on the warming side of the stove, covered, because there would be 2 more people needing to eat when they came in, and they would need something that required no preparation. Something that went straight from the stove to the body like a transfusion. 7 o'clock. 8. Eli had fallen asleep in the armchair by the parlor stove, curled under one of the blankets she'd brought down, his face slack and trusting in sleep in the way children's faces are when they've finally surrendered to exhaustion. She covered him more carefully. She went back to the kitchen. She did not sit down. She found that she couldn't, that sitting felt like something she'd have to fight her way out of when the door opened, and she wanted to be standing when the door opened. She moved instead, small circuits of the kitchen, checking the pot, adjusting the lamp, adding wood, going to the window to look at the nothing and coming back again. She had done all the productive things there were to do. Now she was just keeping watch, which was its own kind of work. 9 o'clock. 10. She baked another small pan of cookies because she needed something to do with her hands, and because the smell of cinnamon was, she had decided firmly, the smell of not giving up. At 10:30, she sat down at the kitchen table with her mother's recipe book open in front of her, not reading it, just resting her hands on the pages. The storm was still loud, but different now. The worst of the violence had passed, she thought, or was passing. The wall of sound had changed from a roar to something more like a sustained moan, the storm exhausting itself, running down like a wound clock. She thought about all the things that could have happened. She stopped herself. That kind of thinking was a hole with no bottom, and she was not going to fall into it tonight. She thought instead about Eli's face when he'd seen the yellow curtains, about Wyatt's fingers touching the embroidered edge of her mother's tablecloth, about the firewood that appeared each morning, stacked higher than she'd left it, the silent language of a man who didn't know how to say anything out loud. She thought about Catherine Pierce, who had grown lavender in a garden on the side of the house no one visited anymore, and who had died at the beginning of a life she'd been building, and who had left behind 2 boys and a man who'd been standing in the wreckage ever since, not knowing how to start clearing it. She thought about what she was doing here, what she was becoming here. At 11:47, by the clock above the kitchen door, she heard it. Not the door, something before the door. A sound from outside, distinct from the wind, that her body recognized before her mind did. A horse. Hooves crunching through packed snow. A voice, 2 voices, and then the heavy, unmistakable sound of the barn door. She was on her feet before she knew she'd stood up. She crossed the kitchen. She turned up the lamp on the counter, turned it as high as it would go, because she wanted the light to be the first thing they saw when the door opened. She went to the stove and swung the pot off the warming rack to the hot burner. She pulled down 2 bowls from the shelf. Then she stood in the middle of the kitchen and waited. The back door opened with a crash, not thrown open, just the wind taking it the moment the latch cleared, slamming it back against the wall. Cold poured in like water, white and savage. Wyatt came through first, hunched forward, snow-caked from head to boot, and Mabel had the coat off his shoulders before he'd finished clearing the threshold. "I'm okay," he said immediately, with the reflex of a boy who didn't want to be fussed over. "I know you are." She steered him toward the stove. "Stand there, don't argue." Colton came in behind him. He had to turn sideways to clear the doorframe, and he moved with the heavy, effortful slowness of a man operating on sheer will. His coat was white on every surface, not dusted but encrusted, the snow having gone through to the wool beneath in the hours he'd been out in it. His face was rawbone red from the cold, the beard rimmed with ice, and his eyes when they found the room, the lit lamp, the hot stove, the bowls waiting on the counter, the warmth that hit like a wall after the cold. His eyes did something she had not seen them do before. They went still, not blank, not closed, just still. The way a person goes still when something registers that they hadn't prepared themselves for. Mabel pulled his coat off his shoulders. It was so heavy with frozen snow, it hit the floor with a clunk. She put a bowl of broth in his hands. "Drink that," she said. "Don't talk yet." He drank. Wyatt had already wrapped both hands around his bowl and was working through it with the focused intensity of a starving person who has remembered their manners just enough not to inhale it. Mabel put bread in front of both of them, refilled Wyatt's bowl before he could ask, and stood at the counter close to the stove, close enough to the heat herself, because she realized suddenly that she'd been cold for hours without noticing. For a while, there was only the sound of the storm outside and the two of them eating, and the tick of the stove, and the small adjustments of the house around all of it. Then Colton set his bowl down. He braced both hands on the table and looked up. He looked at the kitchen, at the lamps, all of them burning, at the bowls, set and waiting before they'd arrived, at the cookie plate on the counter, the cinnamon smell, at the table, where the warmth had clearly been maintained for hours. He looked at all of it the way a man looks at something he needs to understand, something that requires real accounting. Then he looked at her. "You were waiting?" he said. It was not a question. "I kept supper warm," she said. "That's all." Something moved behind his face. A shift, deep and slow, like a fault line adjusting, the kind of movement that doesn't make noise but changes everything about the landscape above it. His jaw tightened. His eyes, pale and winter grey, stayed on her face. "How long?" he said. "Since 6. He was quiet for a long moment. "Wyatt," he said, without looking away from her, "go check on your brother." "Eli's in the parlour," Mabel said. "Asleep. He made cookies and played checkers and ate all his broth. He was fine." Wyatt, already half standing, looked between the two adults with the shrewd perception of an 11-year-old who understands more than he lets on. He picked up his bread and walked toward the hallway. His footsteps were careful going down the hall, quiet outside the parlour door. The kitchen held just the two of them. Colton Pierce looked at her for a long time. The ice in his beard was melting, tracking slow water into the collar of his shirt. He looked like a man who had been taken apart by the cold and put back together in some slightly different arrangement. Not broken, but altered in a way that couldn't be hidden. "I thought it..." He stopped. Started again. "Coming up the lane, I thought the house would be dark." She said nothing. "It wasn't dark," he said. "No," she said. It wasn't." He pulled one hand off the table and ran it through his snow-damp hair, and she could see, in the set of his shoulders, some enormous thing trying to work its way through him and not quite finding the exit. He was not a man who knew how to receive things. Care, attention, the simple fact of being waited for. She could see that clearly as she'd seen the state of the pantry on her first day, as clearly as she'd seen the grief in this house from the beginning. He had been running on empty for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to be filled. "The cattle?" she asked, because he needed practical ground to stand on. "All down. Shelter's holding." He cleared his throat. "Lost one fence post. We'll need to pull new wire before spring." "Wyatt did well?" Something in his face shifted. A father's particular expression, that complicated mixture of pride and the ache of loving something you can't fully protect. "He did," Colton said quietly. "He did real well. He's a good boy." "Both of them are." He looked at his hands on the table. I'm not always..." He stopped again, and the struggle on his face was painful to watch. Not because it was weakness, but because it was the very human difficulty of a person trying to say something true and not having the practice. "You don't have to explain anything tonight," Mabel said. Her voice was steady, kind, but without performance. Just the plain, direct kindness of someone who means it. "You've been out in that for 12 hours. Eat the rest of the bread. I'll get you more." He looked up at her. And for the first time since she had arrived at Iron Creek, since that first cold assessment in the doorway, that silent sweep of recalculation, that single word, "Kitchen's at the back," Colton Pierce looked at her and saw her, not a size, not a problem to be managed, not a solution to a domestic inconvenience, a person, present and deliberate and entirely, undeniably real. She saw him see it. She held it, the way you hold something fragile, carefully without calling attention to the holding. "Thank you," he said. The words came out low and uneven, like something he'd had to dig for. "Mabel." It was the first time he had used her name. She set more bread on the table. She turned back to the stove, and though she would not have said it to anyone, would not have shown it to him, not tonight, not yet, something inside her chest loosened by one quiet degree. Outside, the storm was still going. But it was going in the way of things that have spent themselves, loudly but without conviction, running down toward the silence that follows the end of something. Inside, the kitchen was warm and bright, and that, for now, was enough. The morning after the blizzard, Iron Creek Ranch looked like the world had been remade overnight. Snow had buried the fence lines to their midpoints. The barn roof carried 3 feet of white that would need to come off before the weight became a problem. The chicken coop had drifted in on the windward side, and the lane that connected the ranch to the main road had ceased to exist entirely, replaced by an unbroken plain of white that stretched to the tree line without interruption. The mountains, swept clean on their upper faces by the wind, stood in hard relief against a sky that had gone, with the passing of the storm, to a blue so clear and cold it looked like something you could cut yourself on. It was, in its way, beautiful. Mabel stood on the back porch in the early morning quiet, her coat buttoned to the throat, her breath making small clouds in the still air, and looked at all of it. She had slept 4 hours. She had been up before 5, moving quietly through the house, relighting the stove, starting coffee, checking that Eli was still covered in the parlor. He had not stirred, curled on his side with one hand tucked under his chin. Wyatt had made it up to his own bed at some point in the night. Colton's bedroom door at the end of the upper hall had been closed when she passed it, which she took as a good sign. She had come out here for air and for the particular kind of quiet that exists only after a storm has spent itself, a held, crystalline silence that feels like the world listening to itself breathe. She was still out there when she heard the kitchen door open behind her. Colton came out onto the porch. He had his coat on and his boots, and his hair was still rough from sleep, and he was carrying 2 cups of coffee. He stopped when he saw her, as though he'd expected the porch to be empty. Then he held out one of the cups. She took it. They stood side by side and looked at the altered landscape without speaking for a long while. Their breath rose and mingled in the cold air. Somewhere in the pine stand to the north, a bird was attempting a few tentative notes, the first sound, besides the wind, that the world had produced in what felt like days. "The Granger Road will be impassable for at least a week," he said finally. "I thought as much." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "We have enough in the pantry. I took stock last night." "I know." He paused. "I looked." She glanced at him sideways. He was looking out at the snow, his jaw set in its familiar line, his profile carved out by the sharp morning light. "You looked through my pantry?" "My pantry," he said. And something in his voice was different, a very faint quality she'd never heard there before, something that might, in a man more practiced at it, have been wry. She looked back at the snow. "Fair enough." "You organized it." "I did." The old order made no sense. "I noticed." Another silence, but it was different from the silences of the early weeks, less like a wall, more like a space they were both standing in without threat. "Catherine used to say the same thing," he said, quietly. The name came out without preamble, without the careful construction of a man choosing to share something. It came out the way things come out at 5 in the morning after a near miss in a blizzard, stripped of the usual defenses, just plain and true. She reorganized that pantry 3 times. I kept putting things back in the wrong places. She thought I did it deliberately to aggravate her. "Did you?" The silence held for a beat. "Maybe once or twice." She looked at him. He was still looking out at the snow, but something had shifted in his face. Not softened exactly, more as though a layer had come away, the way ice comes off stone in the first real thaw, and the thing beneath it was less impenetrable than it had appeared. "She sounds like a woman who knew what she wanted," Mabel said. "She was." He drank his coffee. His voice was even, but she had learned to read what was underneath the evenness. She was 23 when she died. She had plans. She talked about the garden she was going to plant, about the schooling she wanted for the boys. She used to say this ranch was just the beginning, that we were building something that would still be standing when we were gone. He stopped. "She was 23, he said again, as though the number still didn't make sense to him after all this time. Wyatt had just turned 4. Mabel said nothing. She let the silence do what it needed to do. "I didn't know how to..." He stopped again, began again, differently. "I knew how to run a ranch, I knew how to work, so that's what I did. I worked. And the boys got older, and the seasons turned, and I kept thinking that at some point it would..." He shook his head slightly. I don't know what I thought, that it would stop feeling like something had been taken out of the center of everything, and the rest was just scaffolding. The bird in the pines tried another sequence of notes, more confident this time. Did it? Mabel asked. Stop feeling that way? He turned and looked at her directly, something he'd been doing more of since the night before, that direct look that had no calculation in it. I don't know yet, he said. Something's different. I can't say what exactly. She held his gaze for a moment, then she looked back at the snow. I lost someone too, she said. Not the same way. My mother, 4 years ago now. She drank her coffee. She was the person who made sense of things for me. When she was gone, I kept turning around to tell her something, and she wasn't there. I did that for over a year. You'd think you'd train yourself out of it, but you don't. You just eventually start turning around a little more slowly. He watched her face as she said it. Is that what it's like? For me it was. She looked at him. I imagine it's different when it's a person you built your life around, when the life itself is what changes shape. The boys don't remember her clearly anymore, he said, and there it was. The thing underneath everything, the wound at the core of it. Eli never did. Wyatt's memories are fragments. A sound she made when she laughed. The color of a dress. His voice stayed controlled, but it cost him. I'm the only one who remembers her completely, and I haven't been able to talk about her with them. I didn't know how to start. Eli told me about the soup, Mabel said. He looked at her. The flat noodles, she said. He told me she made it with flat noodles, and you tried to make it once and used the round ones, and it wasn't right. She paused. He remembers things, Colton, maybe differently than you do, but he remembers. He stood very still. He knows her from the picture on the mantel, Mabel continued. He said so himself. I know her from the picture, and then your Wyatt said, that's not the same. And Eli said, I know. Just like that. He knows it's not the same, and he's carried that quietly his whole small life. She looked at her coffee. He deserved to have someone say her name out loud in that kitchen long before I got here, but I understand why it was hard. Colton said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed, lower, rougher at the edges. You're not easy to have around, he said. She blinked. I beg your pardon? You see things. He said it plainly, without accusation. Most people look at a situation and see what's in front of them. You look at a situation and see what's underneath it. It's... He paused, choosing the word carefully. Disorienting. I'll take that as a compliment. It was meant as one. He finished his coffee, turned the empty cup in his hand. Come inside, it's too cold to stand here. She followed him in. The days that followed the blizzard had a quality unlike anything that had come before them in those months at Iron Creek. The ranch was sealed off from the rest of the world. The Granger Road stayed impassable for 11 days. Holt didn't come, no one came. And in that enforced isolation, something in the household's architecture quietly rearranged itself. Colton worked the property from dawn to dusk as always. There was more to do in the aftermath of the storm than there had been before it. Fence line to repair, drifts to clear from the barn entrance, stock to check with a new urgency, but he came in for all 3 meals now without exception. Not because she'd asked him to, not because it had been established as a rule. He simply came in, hung his coat on the hook, washed his hands at the kitchen basin, and sat down. And he stayed at the table after, longer than necessary, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, while the boys finished their food and the kitchen held all of them in its warmth. He began talking to her. Not the brief functional statements of the early weeks. This fence, that supply run, these hours. Actual conversation, hesitant at first, like a man testing ice before committing his weight to it, but conversation nonetheless. He asked about Missouri, what it looked like, how it differed from Wyoming, what she'd done before the hotel. She answered honestly, leaving nothing decorative about it, because she had long since lost patience with the kind of self-presentation that requires you to leave the complicated parts out. She told him about growing up without much, in the particular way that's not poverty exactly, but is the constant awareness of the distance between what is and what might have been. She told him about her mother's kitchen, the recipes, the step stool, the way food had been the language of love in that house because they hadn't always had the other kinds. She told him about the jobs that had followed, the ones she'd gotten by being capable and the ones she'd lost by being inconvenient, or by taking up too much space in the wrong directions, or simply by being a woman who looked like her and made people who didn't look like her uncomfortable in ways they couldn't fully name. She had not intended to tell him about the Callaway Hotel, It came out one evening 10 days after the blizzard, when they were alone in the kitchen after supper, the boys upstairs, the house quiet, the fire in the parlor stove sending its warmth through the connecting wall. She had been talking about Cheyenne, about the winter she'd arrived there, and then she was talking about the hotel, and then she was telling him about Gerald Calloway's office and the mahogany desk and the way his eyes had moved down the length of her and back up, and the decision that had already been made. She told him about the brooch, about setting it on the dresser, about walking out with $42.70, and her mother's recipe book wrapped in oilcloth in the rain. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Colton had not moved during the telling. He sat with his elbows on the table and his hands loosely together, and he had looked at her the entire time, not with sympathy. She had not wanted sympathy, but with the serious, complete attention of a man hearing something that mattered. "Did anyone speak for you?" he asked. "Anyone at the hotel? Another staff member? A manager?" "There was a woman named Berta who worked the second floor with me. She knew." Mabel looked at her hands on the table. She needed the job. So she said nothing. She said nothing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I believe you." She looked up. "Not because I feel obligated to," he said. "Not because you've been here long enough that I feel I owe you something. Because I know your character." His voice was measured and direct. "I've watched you in this house for 3 months, Mabel. I know who you are, and who you are is not someone who takes things that don't belong to her." She had been told many things in her life. She had been told she was capable by people who meant it as a consolation for not being other things they preferred. She had been told she was lucky by people who didn't understand what luck actually cost. She had been told more times than she could count that it wasn't personal, which was always said by people for whom it was never personal, because nothing ever was. She had not been told, "I believe you," by someone who meant it the way Colton Pierce meant it, simply without decoration as a statement of known fact. It hit her somewhere deep and undefended. She didn't cry. She was not, in general, a woman who cried easily, and she had not cried in front of anyone in years. But her eyes went bright for a moment, and her jaw tightened, and she looked down at her hands and breathed through it. "Thank you," she said when she trusted her voice again. "It's the truth," he said. "That's all." She nodded, pressed her lips together, looked up at the window where the last of the evening light was going violet and blue over the snow. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "People have been looking at me wrong my whole life." She said it simply, the way you say something you've carried long enough that it's lost most of its bitterness. What's left is just the fact of it. "Since I was a girl, I understood very young that there was a version of a woman I wasn't, and that the world had arranged itself to accommodate that version and not mine. And I tried for a long time to take up less space, to apologize for what I looked like by being more useful, more capable, more reliable than anyone else in the room." She paused. "It didn't work. You can't apologize your way into being seen. You just get tired." He watched her face. "I stopped apologizing a few years ago," she said. "I decided I was going to take up the space I took up, and do my work the way I knew how to do it, and let people draw their own conclusions. Some of them draw the wrong ones. Calloway drew the wrong one." She looked at him directly. "You drew a wrong one too. When I got here, I saw it." He didn't flinch. "I did," he said. "I know why. I'm not angry about it. People do what they've been trained to do." She tilted her head slightly. "You stopped. That matters more." He was quiet for a moment, and something moved behind his face, a kind of reckoning, careful and private. "I saw what I expected to see," he said slowly. "That's not an excuse, but that's what it was. And then he paused. "You didn't shrink. Most people, when they arrive somewhere and they're not welcomed properly, they shrink. They make themselves smaller, trying to earn their place. You didn't." "I've been small enough," she said. I'm not interested in getting smaller." He looked at her for a long time. His grey-blue eyes, winter pale and so often closed off, were open in a way she'd seen only glimpses of before. During the blizzard, that first morning on the porch, the night she'd put the tablecloth on the dining room table, and something had moved behind his face too fast to name. "I'm going to ask you something," he said. "All right. And I'd like an honest answer, because I've never been good at asking things twice." "Ask?" He folded his hands on the table. Are you... He stopped, reset. when the road opens again, when Holt comes back, when the world out there becomes accessible again. He kept his eyes on hers. Do you think about leaving? The kitchen was very still. Mabel thought about $42.70 in the rain, about her mother's recipe book wrapped in oilcloth, about the advertisement torn from the Cheyenne Gazette, carried in her coat pocket, dampened and dried and smoothed out so many times it had gone soft at the folds. She thought about yellow curtains and a lavender tablecloth and a 7-year-old boy who'd held the side of her apron in his fist while the storm tried to take everything. She thought about the firewood that appeared each morning, stacked carefully without comment. About Wyatt's fingers on the embroidered edge. About, "I believe you," said plainly, with no ceremony, by a man who didn't say things he didn't mean. "I used to," she said. He waited. "In the beginning, I thought about it constantly," she said honestly. "Every morning for the first 2 weeks. I'd wake up in that room and think about where else I might go, what else I might do, whether it was worth the staying." She looked at him, and then I stopped thinking about it. "When?" she considered. "The day Eli fell asleep in the kitchen," she said. "He'd been in there with me all morning, and he just sat down on the flour sack and went to sleep in the middle of the afternoon like a cat in a patch of sunlight. I put my apron over him." She paused. "I didn't think about leaving after that." Something happened in Colton's face. Not a dramatic thing, not the kind of transformation you'd write down and point to. More like the slow change in a fire that's been burning low, when the air shifts and the logs catch properly and the whole thing brightens without any single moment you can name as the cause. He unfolded his hands. He flattened them on the table and she could see the work in them, the cracked knuckles, the weather-darkened skin, the particular roughness of a man who had used his hands hard for 20 years. "This is not a simple life, Dave," he said. "I won't pretend it is. This land is hard and it's isolating, and the winters are long, and I'm..." A short pause. "I am not easy. I know that about myself. I don't talk enough, and I work too much, and I've spent 3 years building walls that were supposed to keep the grief in, and instead kept everything else out." "I noticed the walls," she said. "I imagine you did." A breath. "What I'm trying to say, and doing poorly, is that I'm aware of what I'm offering and what I'm not. I want you to know that I know the difference." "Between what?" He met her eyes. "Between what this place is and what it could be." He said it with the careful directness of a man reaching for something that cost him. "Between what I've been and what I think I can be." The fire shifted in the parlor stove. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Wyatt, restless, or the house settling. The lamp on the table threw its warm circle over the two of them, and no further. Mabel looked at this man. Widower, rancher, builder of walls, chopper of early morning firewood, father of 2 boys who were going to be all right. She was increasingly certain if they were given even half a chance, and she understood something that she hadn't quite allowed herself to understand before. She was not afraid of what he was offering. She was afraid of wanting it. Those were different things. "I know who you are," she said quietly, and she did. Not perfectly, not completely, because no one knew another person completely. But she knew the shape of him, the hard places and the ones that had gone soft with grief, the silences that meant anger and the ones that meant tenderness and the ones that meant he didn't have the words yet. She knew how he looked at his sons when they didn't know he was looking. She knew what the firewood meant. She knew enough. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He held her gaze. The steadiness in his face was not the steadiness of a man who felt nothing. It was the steadiness of a man feeling too much and holding it with both hands. "Good," he said. "Just that. Just good." But the word in his voice, in that kitchen with the snow still deep on the ground outside and the house warm around them both, carried everything he hadn't figured out how to say yet. She reached across the table and picked up her coffee cup. He did the same. They sat in the easy silence that had replaced the wall of one, and outside, the stars were out over Wyoming, hard and bright and infinite, the way stars are when the air has been scrubbed clean by a long storm. Inside, something that had been broken for a long time was finding its shape again. Not the same shape as before, a new one, built from what had survived the weather, and what had grown up through the wreckage, and what 2 people with scars in different places had decided, carefully and without ceremony, to build together. Spring came to Iron Creek the way it always came to high Wyoming country, so Not all at once, not with any kind of announcement, but in increments so small you could miss them if you weren't paying attention. First, it was the light. The angle of it changed before anything else did, arriving earlier in the kitchen window by a few minutes each morning, staying a little longer in the evenings, falling differently on the table and the floor and the faces of people sitting around it. Then the snow began its slow retreat from the lower pastures, pulling back from the fence lines to reveal the dark, matted grass beneath, flattened by months of winter but alive, still there, waiting. Then the sound changed. The particular silence of deep winter gave way to drip and creak, and the first distant calls of birds returning to the valley from wherever birds went when the mountains became uninhabitable. Mabel noticed all of it. She had become a woman who noticed the ranch in the way you notice a place that belongs to you. Not legally, not yet, not in any formal sense, but in the deeper way of daily attention, of having learned its moods and its rhythms and its trouble spots and its small, unexpected beauties. She knew which floorboard in the upstairs hall sang out at night. She knew that the kitchen window stuck in the cold but opened easily in the thaw. She knew that the east pasture flooded first in the spring runoff, and that Colton would ride out to check the lower fence line 3 days after the serious melt started, without fail, every year. She knew this because he told her. He had begun telling her things, not just the practical logistics of the ranch, but the history of it, the knowledge accumulated over 15 years of working this specific piece of land. He told her about the spring that went cold 2 days before a frost. He told her which section of the upper pasture the cattle preferred and why. He told her things in the evenings beside the fire, in the easy back and forth that had grown up between them over the winter months like something planted in uncertain soil that had nonetheless decided to take root. The boys had noticed. Wyatt, who noticed everything and commented on very little, had taken to sitting closer to Mabel at the table, a small shift in chair placement that said more than any words. He had begun bringing her things without being asked. A handful of early wildflowers from the south-facing slope where the snow cleared first. A smooth stone from the creek bed that he presented with studied casualness and zero explanation. A book he thought she might like from the shelf in the parlour. He borrowed her opinion on things. Which fence post looked weakest? Whether the sky had that wrong colour again? With the naturalness of someone who had decided, without ceremony, that her judgment was worth consulting. Eli, for his part, had simply absorbed her into his understanding of how the world worked, the way children absorb things they consider settled and obvious. She was in the kitchen. She was in the house. She was the person who knew where everything was and how things were done and who made the flat noodle soup on Sundays, and remembered that he didn't eat onions without needing to be reminded. These were facts as basic to him as the mountains and the creek and the colour of the barn. One morning in late March, he came downstairs to find Mabel standing at the kitchen window with her coffee, looking out at the back of the property, the side of the house where Catherine's lavender grew, still buried under the last of the season's snow, but promised by the dark shapes of the woody stems. "It's coming back," he said, appearing at her elbow in his usual way. "It is," she said. "It comes back every year. Wyatt says it always comes back." He pressed his nose to the glass for a moment. "Are you going to grow anything? In the garden?" She had been thinking about it. The neglected garden along the front walk, the one she'd seen on her very first day. A tangle of dead vines and frost-blackened stems that had been crying out for attention all winter. She had plans for it. Specific, considered plans involving things her mother had grown, and things she'd always wanted to grow, and at least one thing she'd grow purely because Eli had said once, offhandedly, that he liked tomatoes. "I'm planning on it," she said. "Can I help? You'll be my primary assistant." He considered this with evident satisfaction. What's primary mean? Most important. Oh. A pause. Okay. She smiled into her coffee. The road to Granger's Bend had been passable since mid-February, and Holt had resumed his Friday runs, which meant the ranch was no longer sealed from the world in the way it had been during those 11 days after the blizzard. The world had, in fact, made several attempts to reintroduce itself. A neighbour had come by with a land question for Colton. The woman with the eggs had come twice. And on a Friday in early March, Holt had arrived with the usual supplies and also, apparently, with news, because Holt, despite charging for silence on that first drive, turned out to be the primary carrier of information in this valley, a function he performed not through gossip exactly, but through the simple mechanism of knowing where everything happened and who was connected to what. He had delivered, along with the flour and the coffee and a new length of wire, the information that Gerald Calloway had sold the hotel in Cheyenne. Mabel had been in the kitchen when Colton came in from unloading the wagon. He'd set the news on the table the same way he set everything, plainly, without drama. Holt says Calloway sold the hotel, he said. Apparently there were some financial difficulties, something about the accounts not reconciling the way they should. She had looked up from what she was doing. Is that right? I thought you'd want to know. She had thought about it for a moment, about Gerald Calloway's mahogany desk and his wife's friendship with Mrs. Henderson, and the way his eyes had moved and the decision that had been made before she walked into the room. She had thought about the rain and the $42 and the way she'd stood on those steps and refused to cry. I suppose I do want to know, she said. And then, I hope whoever bought it does better by the staff. Colton had watched her face. That's all? What else should there be? He had looked at her with something that might have been admiration and might have been relief and was probably both. Nothing, he said. I just thought that I'd want to celebrate. Something like that. She had shaken her head and gone back to what she was doing. She had spent enough of her life giving Gerald Calloway and people like him space in her mind. She had no interest in giving him more. Whatever happened to him was his business. Her business was here, in this kitchen, on this ranch, with these people. That, she had decided, was the most complete form of moving on she had access to. Not dramatic forgiveness, not cathartic confrontation, just the simple act of having built something real enough that the thing that hurt you receded naturally, crowded out by what mattered more. It was on a Saturday morning in mid-April, with the snow entirely gone from the lower pastures and the air carrying the first genuine warmth of the season, that Colton asked her to walk with him. He appeared in the kitchen doorway after breakfast. The boys had gone out, Wyatt to the barn, Eli to investigate something along the creek bank that he'd been monitoring with scientific intensity for the past week. And he had his coat on, but only loosely, held by the top button, which meant the morning was warm enough to be comfortable without it. He was holding his hat in his hand. Walk with me, he said. She looked at him. His face was not nervous exactly, because Colton Pierce was not a man who wore nervousness visibly, but there was something in his bearing that was different from the usual, a kind of collected intention, a man who had decided something and was walking toward it. Let me get my coat, she said. They walked the south fence line first, following the path Colton took most mornings, where the land sloped gently down from the house toward the creek, and then rose again on the far side into the tree line. The grass was coming up green and specific in the low places, the first true green of the year, and the creek ran high and fast with the melt, brown and cold and urgent. The mountains had shed most of their white from the lower faces, the dark rock showing through in broad sweeps, and the sky above it all was the deep, committed blue of a Wyoming spring morning, the kind of blue that makes you understand why people stayed in this country despite everything it asked of them. They walked for a while without speaking, which was nothing unusual. They had walked in comfortable silence many times over the winter, when Mabel had begun accompanying him on some of the shorter evening checks, partly because the cold evenings were easier with company, and partly because these walks had become something they both valued in a way neither had explicitly stated. But today the silence had a quality to it. Colton walked with his hat still in his hand, turning it slowly by the brim, and she could see the working of his jaw. The thing he did when he was composing something. She waited. They had come to the bend in the fence line where the south pasture met the creek bank, where a large flat-topped boulder jutted out over the water, and you could see all the way down the valley to the point where it narrowed between two ridges and disappeared. It was a place she had come to know over the winter. Colton had shown it to her in January, when the creek was frozen and the valley had been a study in white and grey, and she had come back twice on her own since then. He stopped here. He looked out at the valley for a moment, then he turned to her. I need to say something, he said, and I'd appreciate it if you let me get all the way through it before you respond, because I've been working on this for a while and I'm not confident I can restart it if I get interrupted. All right, she said. He looked at her directly, the way he'd learned to do, or perhaps relearned, the way a man relearns things he'd shut off. When you came here in November, he said, I was not a man who was doing well. I don't mean in terms of the ranch was operating. I mean in terms of... He paused. In terms of what I was to my sons, what I was to myself. He turned the hat by the brim once, twice. I had convinced myself that the only responsible thing was to keep moving, keep the work going, keep the boys fed and clothed and educated and safe. That if I did those things, I was fulfilling what was required of me. I didn't understand that I was also disappearing, slowly, into the work. And the boys were watching me disappear, and they were doing what children do, which is take their cues from the person in charge, and they were beginning to disappear too. The creek ran below them. A hawk turned lazy circles above the south tree line. "You changed that," he said. "Not by saying anything particular or doing anything dramatic. You changed it by being present, by paying attention when other people had stopped, by making this place feel like somewhere a person might want to be, instead of somewhere a person was just enduring." He stopped. His voice had stayed steady throughout, but she could hear what was underneath it. The particular roughness of something true that has been carried a long time. "My boys are laughing again," he said. "Eli talks in a way he didn't talk before. Wyatt, I don't know if you've noticed, but Wyatt looks people in the eyes now. He didn't used to. He'd look at his hands, or the floor, or somewhere to the left of your face. He's looking people in the eyes." He looked at her. "He learned that from watching you." She said nothing. She had promised to let him finish. "I know what I am," Colton said. "I'm a man with a hard piece of land and 2 boys who need more than I knew how to give them, and a house that has a lot of empty in it that I've been ignoring for 3 years. I'm not an easy person. I don't talk enough, and I give too little of myself, and I have walls that I'm still working on taking down." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking you to accept all of that as your burden. What I'm asking is..." He stopped, reset. "What I'm asking is whether you'd consider staying here not as someone I employ, but as my partner in all of it, the land, the boys, the life." A pause. "As my wife, if you'd have me." The valley was very still. Mabel looked at Colton Pierce, this man who chopped firewood before dawn, and said, "I believe you like." It was the simplest thing in the world, and had spent 3 years learning how to be hollow, and was now standing on a creek bank in April with his hat in his hands, choosing to try something different. She thought about the woman who had stood in the rain outside the Callaway Hotel with $42 and the absolute conviction that she would not be broken. She thought about the advertisement soft at the folds. She thought about every room she'd ever walked into where the air changed when she came through the door, where people recalibrated, decided things about her before she'd spoken a word, made up their minds about what she was worth based on the space she took up. She thought about what it had felt like to be in a kitchen that became hers, to have a small boy fall asleep against her flour sack, to be told by an 11-year-old boy that his brother talked about her at night, to stand on a porch in the early morning cold and have someone hand her coffee without asking if she wanted it, because he already knew. She thought about what it meant to be chosen, not settled for, not tolerated, not useful enough to keep around, chosen by a man who had looked at her, all of her, and made a clear-eyed decision about what she was worth. Her eyes were bright. She couldn't help that. She allowed it. "You forgot something," she said. He blinked. "What?" "You said the land, the boys, the life." She tilted her head slightly. "You didn't mention the cooking." Something moved across his face, that rare, complicated thing that was Colton Pierce attempting not to smile and failing at the edges of it. "You'd continue cooking." "I would, but I want it acknowledged. The cooking is significant." "The cooking," he said, "has been the single most significant factor in the improvement of life on this property. I will put that in writing if required." She laughed, a real one, full and unguarded, the kind she'd learned not to give out carelessly, but had been giving more freely for months now, in this kitchen, in this house, among these people. Then she looked at him, and the laughter settled into something quieter and more permanent. "Yes," she said. He held very still. "Yes. Yes, Colton, I'll stay. I'll be your partner." She held his gaze. I'll be your wife." He let out a breath, slow and long, the breath of a man who'd been holding something carefully for a long time and had finally been told he could set it down. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and his hand was rough and warm and absolutely certain around hers. They stood like that for a moment, the two of them, above the running creek, with the mountains at their backs and the valley opening out before them, and the hawk still turning its slow circles in the blue. "Eli's going to be insufferable," she said. He already suspected, Colton said. He told Wyatt 2 weeks ago that he thought I was working up to something. 7 years old. He pays attention, Colton said. He learned that from you too. They walked back to the house together, their hands no longer held but walking close, the way people walk when the space between them has closed for good. The wedding was small, as weddings go in that country, a practical affair arranged through the circuit judge who came through Granger's Bend in May, with Holt as witness because he was there anyway and proved surprisingly willing, and the egg woman from the neighbouring property who cried during the brief proceeding and appeared to be moved by it in direct proportion to the depth of her investment in the outcome, which turned out to have been considerable. Eli wore his good shirt and had clean hands and stood very straight and serious throughout, as though the weight of the occasion required his personal structural support. He had, at some point, also apparently appointed himself the person responsible for making sure everyone knew the significance of the event, a role he discharged with characteristic thoroughness by informing Holt, the egg woman, the judge, and the judge's horse, in turn, that Mabel was going to be his mother now. Wyatt said nothing during the ceremony, but afterward, when the judge had gone and Holt had driven back up the road and the egg woman had taken her emotional investment back to her own property, Wyatt found Mabel on the front porch in the afternoon light. He stood beside her for a moment, looking out at the lane. "I'm glad you came," he said. He said it the way he said important things, carefully, without embellishment, with the full weight of meaning behind the plain words. "When you first got here, I'm glad you didn't leave." She looked at him, this 12-year-old boy with his father's eyes and his mother's lost garden, coming back green on the side of the house where no one had gone for 3 years, and all the careful, watchful love he carried in him that was just now beginning to find its way out. "So am I," she said. He nodded once with the decisive finality of a person closing a chapter that needed closing. Then he went inside, and she heard him in the kitchen, apparently helping himself to the wedding cake she had made. A simple spice cake with cream, which Eli had already sampled twice before the ceremony and been redirected from with difficulty. She stayed on the porch. The light was long and golden in the afternoon, the way spring light gets in the high country when the angle is right. It made everything glow from the side, illuminating the individual blades of new grass, the fence posts, the red barn, the mountains beyond. The garden along the front walk was already showing signs of what she was building in it. The dark turned earth, the staked rows, the small green shoots of the things she'd planted 3 weeks ago, beginning to push up through the soil. Tomatoes for Eli. Lavender, because it had always grown here and always would. A climbing rose for the porch trellis, because she had always wanted one, and this was, she had decided, a place where wanting things was permitted. Colton came out and stood beside her. He looked at the garden, he looked at the mountains, he looked at her. "We should probably go inside," he said, "before Eli eats the entire cake." "Let him," she said. "It's a celebration." He slid his hand into hers. She closed her fingers around it. They stood in the golden light of the afternoon, on the porch of the house that had been dark and silent when she'd arrived, that had slowly become something else, something lit from the inside, something that produced smells of bread and cinnamon and broth and coffee, something that held laughter now, actual laughter, easy and unguarded, the kind that fills up the corners of a house and stays there long after the sound itself is gone. She thought about the woman who had walked up this lane in November, in the cold, with nothing but her suitcase and her mother's recipe book and the absolute refusal to be broken. She thought about what that woman had wanted, underneath all the practicality and the rolled-up sleeves and the careful management of expectations. What she had always wanted, really, in the place beneath the place she admitted to. Not to be tolerated, not to be useful, not to be kept around because someone needed the cooking done. To be seen, completely, by someone who had the full picture, all of it, the size and the scars, and the $42, and the false accusation, and the mother's recipes, and the refusal, and the loneliness, and the love she'd been giving out into the world for years with no particular expectation of return. And to be told, with absolute clarity, yes, you, exactly as you are, stay. She had that now. She held onto it the way she held Colton's hand, not desperately, not as though it might be taken, but with the quiet, certain grip of someone who has arrived somewhere real, who has stopped waiting for permission, who has understood at last that belonging is not something that gets assigned to you by the opinions of others. It is something you build, you, with your hands, with your attention, with the daily, deliberate act of showing up and staying and feeding people and keeping the fire burning and waiting with the lamp lit, even when the storm is at its worst and the hour is very late, and there is no guarantee of what comes through the door. That was what she had always known how to do. And this house, this land, this man, these boys, this garden coming up green in the April earth, this was what it had always been building toward. Inside, she heard Eli shout something at Wyatt, and Wyatt's measured response, and then the unmistakable sound of small feet running across a wooden floor and a chair being dragged, and both of them arguing with the cheerful, fundamental energy of brothers who have remembered what it is to be children. Colton squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. They went inside together, into the warm and noisy house, into the life that was waiting for them. Messy and imperfect and absolutely, irreversibly real. The woman whom no one had wanted had become the heart of Iron Creek Ranch. Not because she had shrunk herself into something acceptable, not because she had apologized her way into belonging, but because she had walked through a cold door with her mother's recipes and her own 2 hands and the unshakable conviction that she had something worth giving, and she had given it fully and without holding back, until the people around her remembered what it felt like to receive it. Some things cannot be taken from you. Not your worth, not your voice, not the love you carry, or the strength that brought you through the worst of it, or the knowledge, hard-earned and bone-deep, that you were never, not for a single moment, as small as the world tried to make you believe. Mabel Hart had always known that. Now she was home.